So we're going to look at some artworks and talk about the kinds of color decisions that the artists have made, especially in the context of how does it change the way the viewer interacts with the work. Sometimes we're going to find artworks that fit some of the color harmony definitions that we've talked about, and sometimes they won't, but we're still interested in how is the artist employing color. The first one is this Terry Winters painting, which I chose deliberately because it's kind of nuts in its composition. There's a lot going on. All of those radiating lines, a lot of different shapes, a lot of overlapping. It's an extremely active composition. One of the things that keeps it sane for us to look at it is the fact that he has actually chosen an analogous color harmony. We can see that we've got reds, oranges, and yellows. Imagine if this image was a split complement color harmony. We would probably throw up as soon as we looked at it. It would just be too overwhelming. So he can have a still very active composition, especially because he's choosing very warm, vibrant, high-intensity colors, but they at least sit well enough together that we aren't completely overwhelmed by his very active composition. We can see some of that same kind of decision-making happening in these two David Reed paintings. The one over here on the right is a complementary color harmony. We have reds and greens, and we have variations within red and green, but they basically are those two colors. It's very active, it's very dynamic, but look at the way in which he is still using, with one exception, really low intensity versions of the green. And the one part that is a high intensity green is sort of tucked in underneath some of the other compositional elements. There's a lot of activity in the brushwork, but look at how he's using straight edges and rectangles so that we have the unity of that kind of underlying grid that gives some structure to this image. It's very dynamic, but it isn't completely overwhelming in terms of the color contrasts. That one flash of really intense green kind of gives us a focal point without making us nauseous. If we look at the one on the left, you can see that he is breaking out of the rectilinear forms and letting the sort of squiggly brushwork squid tentacle things go a little more crazy. And he can get away with that in this composition because it's an analogous color harmony. We have this blue-green, we have the purple, we have the dark blue of the background. These colors are going to sit more quietly together. So instead of getting his dynamism through color contrasts, he's going to get his dynamism through the activity of the mark making. This is an image that we might initially think of as an analogous color harmony. It's dominated by the blues and the greens and the flicks of yellow. But as a good example of how artists don't just create work to illustrate my slide talks, Inka Isenhai is using something that we are going to define as a limited palette rather than a true analogous color harmony. Why isn't it analogous? Because she has some oranges in here. The orange that happens on the peeling bark of the branch is the complement to the blue, so we could no longer call this an analogous color harmony. What we can see, though, is the way in which she is limiting her palette, not using every color that is available to her, and instead choosing a lot of really soft, very cool, low-intensity greens that sit well with the blue of the sky. The sky is a fairly intense blue, but it doesn't overwhelm because it's a cool color that sits back in the background. Also, the way in which he's using the blue throughout the landscape helps for a unified theme. And then it makes perfect sense that we've got the fireflies as these moments of light, but we can still see that they are closely related to the blues and the greens. So it's not a true analogous color harmony, but it's using a lot of the same qualities of colors that agree with each other. How does an artist want to control their color? They're going to choreograph the space based on color decisions to evoke, in this case, a mood. There's this kind of mystery, quiet stillness with a little bit of a kind of magical anticipation quality. That blue's just a little too intense, the fireflies are a little too active, so that it feels like something could be happening, but she still keeps everything closely related with her limited palette. A lot of times artists are making these decisions not just because of what they look like, but because of the way in which they're going to communicate their intent. When Cynthia Camlin is making paintings about climate change with icebergs as a subject matter, that makes sense both as a subject matter, but also in terms of how she's using that analogous color harmony to get us to understand the complexity of the issue, that there's a lot more going on below the surface. It also makes sense that she's choosing watercolor because we have that sense of washy, dissolving aspects to it. So these formal decisions, using watercolor, using an analogous color harmony, are true, but they're also frequently in the service of how I'm trying to communicate. Sometimes I'm going to use the positive qualities of an image or a color harmony to communicate, but I don't necessarily have to feel like I have to follow every single rule of it. At first glance, this might appear to be a monochromatic image. It's got a lot of that sort of golden yellow-orange, and yet we can see that there is more variety than that, and so then we might think it's an analogous color harmony. But actually it isn't, because again, we have blues and oranges in the same composition. This is another example of a limited palette. What's really interesting also is the way in which she is limiting her palette, not only in terms of her color choices of which hue categories to use, but also in how she's using her value decisions. We have a lot of light values that blend in with the background to create that recessional space. We have a really clear background, middle ground, foreground, where we have much more dynamic value contrasts. So a limited palette could be hue selection, but could it also be about how we're using value within our decisions?